Are we started? Okay, thank you all for coming to Shannon Schlater's defense. Really excited to be here. This is the first of my graduate students who are defending, so this is, I feel like an equally big moment for me as it is for Shannon, maybe not quite. But I'm just so incredibly proud of Shannon and the work that she's done. She came here to us from Ohio Wesleyan, and it has really been a pleasure to see her develop as a scientist. She's going to talk to you about two of the papers that she's worked on as part of her graduate degree today, but she should walk away from this with 5 publications when all is said and done. So I think that that's really quite impressive for a master's student, and so I'm really excited for you to hear about all that today, and so I will turn the time over to her.
Perfect. Thank you, Justin. Such a nice intro. So like he said, I'm going to be talking about my research that I've been doing over the past 2 years on red-tailed hawks in this highly fragmented agricultural landscape that we know as Nebraska. Before I get started, I just want to thank my funding sources, specifically the Nebraska System Science Grant, as well as MPG Ranch. A big thank you to my committee, as well as everyone that's been able to help me in the field and really make this project as good as it has been. Just some personal acknowledgments. Thank you to everyone for moral support in the actual project itself. My undergraduate advisor is a volleyball coach that helped me even get into graduate school. I am so grateful for all the support that I've been able to have over these past 2 years and before that as well. And so why raptors? Why is raptor conservation? Why is raptor research important? Raptors provide an excellent ecosystem services for us. They're able to deplete small mammal populations such as rodents, squirrels, rabbits, and they keep those nuisance populations nice and low, which is great for us that live in neighborhoods. It's great for agricultural fields, just a great ecosystem service in general. Additionally though, they provide excellent aesthetically pleasing additions to wildlife communities. So anytime I talk about the raptor research that I'm conducting to just a general person in the public, I'm always greeted with some kind of fun anecdote about a time they saw a hawk or an eagle or an owl do something exciting. And it's just clear that the public really appreciates raptors in our wildlife communities, and it can help motivate further conservation interests. And so just a nice background or outline of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to give you a background on red-tailed hawks, then I'm going to discuss those 2 chapters, and then discuss some potential management implications and future research based on what I've been able to do. And so red-tailed hawks are one of the most common hawks across North America. So if you're not sure if you've ever seen one, there's a good chance you have. If you've ever been driving down the roadside and seen a hawk sitting on a utility pole or a tree, there's a very good chance that it was a red-tailed hawk. They're a generalist species, meaning they prey on a wide range of prey items, from small mammals, birds, insects, reptiles, pretty much anything that they can find. They're a wait-and-see perch hunter most often, which means like this bird shown in the picture here, they like to sit on tall perches and then they wait and look in the landscape below for movement, at which point they'll then dive down to acquire that prey item. However, they are an extremely adaptable species, so they've actually been identified as having different hunting styles, such as hunting from flight, as well as aggressively hunting, seeking out squirrels from holes in trees, as well as from squirrel nests. And so if you want to know how to identify a red-tailed hawk in the field, as the name suggests, you're going to want to look for that characteristic red tail. And if you see that tail, you're going to know that it's an adult or an after second year individual. Before that, the first and second year juveniles are going to have a brown tail, and they might be molting in a few red tails, as you can see, tail feathers, as you can see in that second year individual picture. Additionally, the juveniles are going to have a yellow eye, and the after second year adults are going to have a much darker eye. Other characteristics that you're going to want to look for to identify a red-tailed hawk in the field are the patagial bar, the belly band, and looking at their crural feathers. So the patagial bar is this dark marking underneath the wing. And this is something that only red-tailed hawks have. So if you see this marking, you're automatically going to know that that is definitely a red-tailed hawk. Additionally, that belly band is the dark coloration along the belly. And this is a little more, not quite so cut and dry. You may have dark morph red-tailed hawks, and so they wouldn't have a belly band. And then you might have really light morph red-tailed hawks that have mostly white chests. And then last we have the cruel feathers, which for raptors are the feathers that cover their legs. And so red-tailed hawks can be seen as wearing shorts, so their cruel feathers only go about halfway down their leg, whereas other raptor species wear pants, where their cruel feathers go all the way down to their feet. And so to help you distinguish from other budios in the field, we're going to talk about 3 similar looking budios. First we have the Swainson's hawk, and you're going to want to look for this bib around their neck. This dark coloration here is going to signal if that is a Swainson's hawk, whereas a red-tailed hawk would never have a bib. If anything, they're going to have that belly band. Further, we have a rough-legged hawk, and these raptors are going to wear pants, so they're going to have those feathers all the way down to their legs. And then last, we have a red-shouldered hawk, which are much smaller than red-tailed hawks, and they're going to have red stripes on their chest instead of that belly band. And then as for all 3 of these raptor species, they're not going to have that characteristic red tail that you're going to want to look for in a red-tailed hawk. And so like I said, red-tailed hawks are common across North America, as you can see in this map. They are a partial migrant species, which essentially means it depends on their natal latitude whether or not they're going to migrate. So if they're born in a latitude anywhere between 38 to 42 degrees northern latitude, Nebraska is about 40 for those that aren't aware, it's going to really depend from individual to individual of whether they stay in that territory year-round or whether they migrate. And if they choose to migrate, they're going to be able to take advantage of flourishing resources in the north during the summer, and they can avoid that harsh winter that we all had to face during the winter season. However, they're going to abandon their breeding territory, which is where residents kind of take over, and they have that advantage. They can defend their breeding territory all year round, and they're able to avoid that really costly migration. And so now I want to jump into talking about my research concerning the red-tailed hunting habitat here in Nebraska. And so the purpose of the study was driven by the fact that even though red-tailed hawks are so common, very little research has actually been conducted on them. And specifically in agricultural areas, not much has been done. And so you can imagine that in Nebraska, this used to be a lot of grassland habitat that's now been converted to row crops, specifically a lot of irrigated corn. And so we want to understand what characteristics are influencing their presence and absence, and what characteristics are associated with their hunting habitat. And so past research has found red-tailed hawks to avoid hunting in tall corn crop fields. And this is thought to be that the vegetation is just so thick and so dense, they're not able to penetrate through to acquire prey. Even though there may be abundant prey in these crop fields, they're just not able to access it. Conversely, they also avoid these bare, harvested crop fields because now there are no prey resources even available for them. So they don't have that vegetation as an issue. They're able to see the prey items. The issue is there are no resources to support small mammal populations in this area. And so they're not really able to acquire resources in these kind of habitats as well. And so our hypothesis in this study is that red-tailed hawks are going to be in areas, hunting in areas where vegetation is sparse enough that they can see prey and hunt in those areas, but there has to be vegetation present to support abundant prey populations. So we're still expecting to see them hunting in areas where prey is quite abundant compared to areas where they are not. And so what we did to answer these questions was I drove roadside raptor surveys starting in September of 2017. I had Route A and Route B. I drove both of those routes every week for a full year, so resulting in 104 total raptor surveys. You can see that the northern part of the study site wasn't surveyed very well, and this is just because these roads were very inaccessible by car, and so they were just excluded from the study area. And so in these roadside raptor surveys, anytime I spotted a raptor, I would stop the vehicle, I would take a GPS location, I would record the species, age, sex, the perpendicular distance from the vehicle. I would record the landscape directly beneath the bird. I would record their activity, which was often flapping flight, soaring flight, or perched. If they were perched, I then recorded what type of perch, so typically a utility pole or a tree. I also recorded flight direction, whether they were flying when I first spotted them or they flew off once I had stopped the car. And this was important in determining if any birds were going to be potential recounts as I continued on with the survey. So if I was going to be driving south and a bird flew south, I needed to be aware that that bird may be where I am driving towards. And then I also just recorded any subsequent behaviors that the bird may have performed while I was sitting there watching it. So if it began to hunt, or it flew off, or flew over to a mate, that information was recorded as well. And with this information, I was able to identify high and low use locations used by red-tailed hawks. And this was done every season, so winter, spring, summer, fall. And it was done based on 40 roadside raptor surveys. And these high and low use locations were selected only in areas where utility poles were present. And this was done because of two reasons. First is past research is clear. Utility poles are extremely, extremely important for red-tailed hawks because they are sit and wait perch hunters. Additionally, we determined no high use locations in areas where utility poles were not present. And so it was obvious that they were very important. And we wanted to capture habitat characteristics outside of those utility poles. And so I was able to upload the GPS locations of red-tailed hawk sightings into ArcGIS. I then ran a point count density estimator in order to create the figures as you can see here. And so the dark blue are going to be areas where a lot of red-tailed hawk sightings were reported. Areas where no dark blue circles can be seen are areas where I never saw a red-tailed hawk on my routes. And so those areas would be low use sites. And so for this data, I might pick these 10 high and 10 low use sites. And like I said, we're going to avoid areas where utility poles are not present. So even though these circled areas, there are no red-tailed hawk sightings that can be seen as low use, there are no utility poles there, and so I would not have selected them as a low use location. And so once I chose those 20 surveyed spots, I continued on with some small mammal trapping. This was done using Sherman live small mammal traps, which were baited with mixed seeds and oats. Each site was sampled for 3 consecutive mornings, so just to get a fair bit of sampling at each site. And when we captured a small mammal, we would put it in a plastic bag, scruff its neck, and we would put a little Sharpie marking on its forehead in order to account for recaptures in the following days. And here's the setup of those small mammal traps for each of the high and low use sites. We would place out 15 of these Sherman traps in the vegetation next to the roadside. The center trap directly in front of a utility pole with 7 on each side, placed about 3 meters apart. And you can tell they're pretty random, but they would be faced different directions, closer to the road or closer to the crop field adjacent, just so we're really sampling different areas of that roadside vegetation. And this was mirrored on the other side of the road as well. And just note that this is not to scale, just a nice figure that I was able to make. And with that data, we were able to determine 2 different things. First, we determined if there was a difference between small mammal abundance between high and low use sites, and then we also ran a Shannon-Wiener diversity index to determine if there was a difference in small mammal diversity between high and low use sites. And for sake of time, I'm not going to discuss the species diversity findings. We're just going to be talking about that abundance data. And what we found is that across all seasons, there was never a difference detected between high and low use sites for small mammal abundance. So you can see that even though as the seasons progress, we're increasing those small mammal populations as it's their breeding season, but between high and low use sites, we never detected a difference in the overall abundance. And it's very possible that the predator-prey cycle prevented us from being able to detect a difference, because I'm surveying these sites after I continually see red-tailed hawks in these locations. And so they may be depleting their own prey sources in those areas. And so by the time we small mammal trap, there's no longer any difference being detected. From there, we did some vegetation surveys in the same locations. So you can see that these are where the Sherman traps were placed. I used a 1 by 1 meter quadrat, 4 quadrats per transect, so again replicated on the other side of the road. And within this quadrat, I took several vegetation measurements. First, I made an initial observation of vegetation cover, so percent ground, grasses, forbs, shrubs, and leaf litter. I also took 5 standardized measurements of vegetation height, and then I took some measurements of vegetative obstruction. And this was done using a light meter as seen in the picture here. So essentially, I'm getting a control measurement of the amount of light that hits the light meter when not obstructed by the vegetation. I would then take a measurement on the very bottom of the ground underneath the vegetation, and the amount of light that's able to penetrate through would give me that ground level measurement. So using this habitat as an example, this isn't a very vegetative, obstructive, very dense habitat. And so I might get a calculation of 1,000 on top of the meter stick, and then 900 on the very bottom of the ground, because not much vegetation is obstructing that light from getting through. And so this would give me an obstruction value of 0.1. However, for a very dense site, I might only get 100 on the very bottom of the ground, because not much light is able to get through. That vegetation is obstructing the view. And this would give me an obstruction value of 0.9, a very high, densely vegetated site. And you can imagine how this is similar to a red-tailed hawk hunting from a utility pole above. If they're not able to see through to the bottom of the ground where a small mammal would be, that vegetation is very obstructive to them. And so we found several different significant differences between high and low use sites for this data. First, I want to talk about the vegetation density, or that obstruction. So during the summer, which is when vegetation is most grown out and most thick, we found that low use sites seem to be more obstructive or denser than high use sites. So essentially, red-tailed hawks are avoiding hunting in areas where the vegetation is so dense that they're not able to see the prey below. Further, in the winter and fall, we found that they seem to be selecting for areas where the vegetation is taller, so high use sites had taller vegetation than the low use sites. Though you'll notice there was no difference in these obstructive values during this time. So as long as the vegetation is not too dense, they seem to be selecting for areas where the vegetation is taller. And this is possibly because it's a higher quality habitat for the small mammals in those areas. And so therefore, it's kind of demonstrating that they may be actually selecting for areas with more prey abundance, and we just missed it in our small mammal trapping due to that predator-prey cycle. And so overall, our results show that we did not determine a difference between small mammal abundance for high or low use sites. We did determine that during the summer, when vegetation is most grown out, they seem to be avoiding very dense areas. And they seem to select for areas of taller vegetation so long as the vegetation is not too dense and they're able to spot prey in the landscape below. A limitation of this study, however, is that when I'm driving these roadside raptor surveys, I cannot confirm that that red-tailed hawk I'm observing is hunting. I can't confirm that they chose that location because of the landscape below. It may be shady, it may provide shelter, it may be a very tall perch and it provides them an excellent view of their territory, or their mate or their offspring may be close by, and that's why they chose that location. However, in spite of this, we were still able to determine that red-tailed hawks' most optimal hunting habitat seems to be in areas where the vegetation is not too dense, not too thick, and then they also are selecting for areas where the vegetation is tall, likely because there are more small mammals in those areas. And then so the next chapter I'm going to be talking about concerns the breeding home range of red-tailed hawks. And so as I get started, I just want to give you a little background on the breeding behavior of red-tailed hawks. They produce anywhere between 1 to 3 eggs, and they can fledge all 3 of those as well. The male and females will share nesting duties, though typically males are going to do more of the hunting, and females are going to do more of the care of the nest, so more of the incubating and the feeding of the nestlings. Eggs can be laid anywhere from early March to mid-May, so we definitely have red-tailed hawks out there either incubating right now or really preparing to lay those eggs. Incubation lasts for about 30 days, followed by a 46-day nestling period, and then that fledgling period obviously is going to vary from pair to pair, but during that time they're going to continue to feed those offspring and help teach them how to hunt. And so the objectives of this study was we wanted to determine if there was an overall difference between the breeding size home range of breeders and non-breeders. So we would anticipate breeding red-tailed hawks to have a smaller overall home range size than non-breeders. And this is because they're constrained to a centralized nest location, and they're not able to wander off. So if prey resources are limited around a breeding pair, they're not going to be able to leave the nest for very long in order to try and acquire more resources. Non-breeders, however, can be in an area of scarce prey availability and then just leave and find a new area to hunt in. We also wanted to look at the space use of breeders and non-breeders throughout the breeding season. So we anticipate that breeders are going to increase space use from the incubation period to the nestling period to when they fledge their offspring. And as you can imagine, they're going to spend a lot of time at the nest during the incubation period, just continued location after location, sitting on those eggs. As the nestlings are hatched and they require more resources, the parents can then leave the nest for longer periods of time in order to acquire sufficient resources for those young. And finally, we'll expect them to increase further once they actually have the nestlings leave the nest. Once they fledge, they're no longer constrained to that nest location, and so they can use the most space during that time. Non-breeders, on the other hand, we expect to do the exact opposite. So we anticipate they're going to use the most space during the early breeding season because that's when resources are most limited. If you remember from my research on the small mammals for my last chapter, small mammal populations were pretty low during the spring trapping sessions as well as summer. They then increase during the fall season. And so they're not going to have to travel as far by that late breeding season in order to acquire sufficient resources. Another factor that may influence them constraining their home range throughout the season is that as breeders increase, breeders are very territorial, they may constrain a non-breeder to use less and less space over time. And so what we did to answer this question was we put out GPS transmitters on red-tailed hawks. And so we at UNK teamed up with Raptor View Research Institute in Montana. They began putting GPS satellite transmitters out on red-tailed hawks in 2014. And then we put out GPS GSM transmitters in 2017. And the only difference here is the technology part. So they're very similar, they're placed in similar locations. I'm holding the GPS GSM transmitter, and over here you can see the satellite transmitter with the antenna right here. But they weigh both about 30 grams, and they're recording the same location data as well. And so with this data, we were able to identify actually 3 types of red-tailed hawks. Obviously we have those breeders, but we had 2 different types of non-breeders. We had those that inhabited a single territory throughout the season, and then we had those that inhabited multiple territories throughout the season. So these non-breeders with multiple territories had really clear, obvious migratory pathways away from one territory to another. And so we wanted to subset the birds' data into early, mid, and late breeding season. And so for the breeders, this was pretty straightforward. I would look at their GPS location data and determine the onset of incubation just based on the day that GPS location after GPS location was taken at an assumed nest spot. And that was deemed as the start of incubation. I then subset it 30 days for that incubation period for early, 46 days for that mid period, and then the late period represents their fledgling period, anywhere between 17 and 44 days. And the reason that varies so much is because some birds just their transmitters stopped uploading locations after a given time, and some migrators actually left a little earlier than resident breeders. The non-breeders' start date was a little more tricky because the onset of incubation for our breeders varied so widely, and it didn't correlate with the latitude of their nest. And so what we ended up doing was we averaged the Julian start date of incubation for those breeders. And that ended up being May 1st, and that was used as the start date for all non-breeders, and so they all have the same early, mid, and late period dates. And then I just want to talk a little more specifically about these non-breeders with multiple territories, just because they've kind of provided a little hitch in our analyses. Since they have these migratory pathways, this isn't really space that's being used by that bird for hunting. It's just traveling over that area to get to a new territory. And so what we ended up doing was omitting those GPS locations completely. And I was able to analyze individual home ranges separately. And so say for this individual, they inhabited Nebraska during the early stage, but then they left to South Dakota also during the end of that early stage. I would add those home ranges together and determine their overall space use because they are using additional space by traveling to a new territory. And so I ran an autocorrelated kernel density estimator to determine the 95% and 50% home range size. So the 95% is just their general overall space use, and the 50% is going to be where the majority of their locations are. I then ran a Kruskal-Wallis test to determine first, is there a difference between the overall home range size of breeders and both of the types of non-breeders? And then I also used that test to determine, is there a difference between that early, mid, and late breeding season period? And to give you a nice visual of the locations of these birds, the breeders can be seen by a circle, the non-breeders with a single territory are seen with a triangle, and the non-breeders with multiple territories are not included in this figure just because there were 7 of them. They had anywhere between 2 and 6 territories, and so this map would have gotten really complicated really fast. But you can see the nice range and locations that we have for all of our birds. And what we were able to determine is that breeders did in fact have the smallest breeding season home range size compared to both of the non-breeders. This was anticipated as they are constrained to that nest location compared to both non-breeders, which can wander as needed. We also anticipated that the non-breeders with multiple territories would use the most space because they're traveling to additional territories, adding to that space use over time. And so non-breeders with multiple territories had larger breeding season territories, home range size, than both the non-breeders with single territories and the breeders. As for the breeders, we found that that late breeding season stage did in fact have the largest home range size, and this was anticipated as that fledgling period, they're no longer constrained to a nest location. We did not, however, detect a difference between the early and mid stage. And while this wasn't anticipated, it does make sense because during the first 2 weeks of the nestling period, those nestlings are pretty much useless. They can barely sit up in the nest and they can't thermoregulate well. So parents are still spending a good majority of their time there. And here is a visual of a breeding female who bred in Alaska. And you can see this dark red is going to be that early period during incubation. The mid period is going to be this medium red. And then the late fledgling period is that light red. So you can really see how she's expanding out throughout the breeding season. As for the non-breeders with single territory, as anticipated, they used, in general, less space throughout the breeding season. However, this was not significantly found. So it's a general trend of decreasing, but it was not significant, largely because there was so much standard error in our birds' home range sizes that it just was not detected. And so as an example of a non-breeder with a single territory, we now have the early stage as this light color, so they're using the most space, and then they use less space in that medium purple, and then the dark purple is the late stage. So you can really see how they're decreasing their space use over time. And it's possible that this is because more prey resources are becoming available and they don't have to travel as far. However, it could also be that there's a territorial breeding pair over here, and as they expand, they're forcing this bird to constrain and avoid this area. And so maybe that's what's driving this space use to decline. Similarly, the non-breeders with multiple territories also, we found a general decline in space use throughout the breeding season. Again, it was not detected as significant, largely because of how much standard error we had between birds. An example here would be this individual that migrated north. It started out in Nebraska at the beginning of the breeding season, and then it ended up in Canada by the late breeding season. And so it's most likely what's driving these movements is the flourishing resources in the north by the end of the summer. And so they're traveling north in order to acquire these abundant resources in this area during that time. However, it could also be that territorial breeders are pushing them out. If this Nebraska habitat is filled with territorial breeders, it may just be easier to leave and go somewhere else. Or they could be prospecting potential breeding territories for future seasons. So they may be traveling throughout Nebraska to see if there's an opening. If there's not, and they travel north in order to look for an area there. And so overall, our results suggest that breeders do in fact use the most space during the late breeding season. This was anticipated as they are able to leave the nest and care for their fledglings elsewhere. And it's really going to be important that we ensure there's enough space for them to successfully fledge their young during this time. As for the non-breeders, in raptor research, non-breeding birds are called floaters because of their ability to travel throughout territories and fill vacancies. So you can imagine if a mate dies, a floating non-breeding red-tailed hawk can fill that vacancy very quickly, and it prevents any time lag for that breeder that remains alive. And so, unfortunately, before GPS transmitters really came into play, we don't have much research on non-breeding raptors, and so not much is known about what drives their space use, as well as their habitat selection. And so they're really important to study because they drive that population stability for raptors, and so more definitely needs to be done concerning their space use. And so to end, I just want to talk about a few management implications and future research based on what I've been able to find so far. So back to that hunting habitat, we really determined that you can manage habitat in order to attract or detract red-tailed hawks. And so you can imagine we might want to detract red-tailed hawks from hunting on I-80 if their rates of mortality are really high there. If they're hunting and they're getting hit by cars a lot, it's actually going to be beneficial if we just prevent them from hunting in those areas. And instinctively, we're going to want to remove utility poles or trees because that's obviously the most important factor for them. However, that's not always feasible to remove utility poles and trees from the roadside. And so what we might be able to do is have really dense vegetation that prevents them from being able to hunt in those areas. And similarly, we're going to want sparser but taller vegetation in areas where we do want red-tailed hawks. And then last, future research for red-tailed hawks would be to examine their hunting habitat in different regions. So red-tailed hawks can be found in cities. So you can imagine in New York, the tall or dense vegetation is probably not going to influence their hunting ability if they're hunting pigeons and rats. And so it would be important to understand what factors are influencing their hunting there. And similarly, we had red-tailed hawks in Alaska, and you would want to imagine there's going to be something else that's driving their hunting in a very different region, especially when the light is different during the breeding season. They're going to be hunting differently. And similarly, I would want to understand what they do to adjust when vegetation is so dense or when snow prevents them from being able to hunt. Do they switch and hunt rabbits and squirrels instead, or do they simply travel elsewhere to hunt? And then for the home range data, like I said, we're going to really want to ensure that breeders have enough space to successfully fledge their offspring. And then as for those non-breeders, it's going to be important that managers and researchers understand non-breeders are inhabiting these areas. And we want to understand what's driving their presence. Is it forage? Is it the absence of territorial breeders? Or are they looking for a potential place to nest? And future research here would be to compare the habitat selection of red-tailed hawks, both breeders and non-breeders, between seasons. So during the breeding season, you can imagine a breeder is going to choose a site based on the nest location, and a non-breeder might be selecting more for prey availability or the absence of territorial breeders. However, during the winter season, the presence of a nest location is less important, and so they're going to be selecting for maybe similar things during that time. So it'd be important and valuable to understand seasonally how habitat selection differs between those breeders and non-breeders. And then further, I would want to understand how home range size differs between male and female red-tailed hawks. females are typically larger than males. And so if we're making the argument that prey availability influences home range size, then females should have a larger home range size than males because they're going to have higher energy requirements and they're going to have to require more prey availability compared to a much smaller male. And then last, red-tailed hawks are extremely common, they're extremely abundant, and yet not much research has been done on them. And that's really a shame because research is really, really easy on them. It's really feasible because they are so common and abundant. And so by studying them, we can compare these findings that I've been able to make about red-tailed hawks, and we can compare them to other raptors that aren't so common or just maybe harder to study. And so I'm really proud of what I've been able to do, and I hope that what I've been able to study and find can be related to other raptors as well. And with that, thank you so much. And I'll take questions.
So with the GPS, the breeders, non-breeders, like when you attach the GPS, were you able to identify like the sex and age approximately of the
So
animal?
we were able to determine if they were a juvenile or an adult, not like a specific year. And then we made a guesstimate of sex because females are larger than males, but you have to confirm with a blood sample whether they are male or female, which we did not do.
Right, okay. Because I was gonna say that would be cool because you have you can see who's
Right.
who, but okay, yeah.
Yeah, and if our guesstimates are right, we have mostly females, so we only have 2 males, I believe.
So did you put them all on older birds, or did you have some on younger birds?
So the UNK birds, we only had 3 juveniles, 2 died relatively quickly. 1 was a vehicle collision, 1 unknown, and 1's transmitter never connected again, so I think she probably died as well. Of the raptor view, I believe they had 2 juveniles, and I think they both lived and are still being in the study. So my data, only 1 was a juvenile. Yes.
Did you look at differences in home range sizes of your guesstimates of what the sexes were? Were they differing between the two, between female and male, as far as you thought?
Right. I didn't look at it more than just anecdotally kind of observing. And but of the 2 males they did, 1 was a non-breeder with multiple territories, and 1 was a breeder. The breeder had an extremely small home range compared to the other female breeders. And then the non-breeder with multiple territories obviously just used a lot of space because that's what they did. Yes.
Did you notice that juvenile moving any differently than the adults?
Of the juveniles, it was a non-breeder with multiple territories, so that's kind of expected compared to other raptor research, is they typically move around more. One project that has been done on non-breeding raptors was with bald eagles, and all non-breeders with a single territory were adults, and the non-breeders that wandered were adults and juveniles, so it kind of matched up with that as well.
Have there been any studies looking at reproductive success in the migrants? Like, because it's a trade-off, right? Where
Right.
that they leave, but then they lose the rest of the, so is there a difference in reproductive success between those 2
Right.
strategies? Has anyone looked at that?
Not that I've seen, no specifically I haven't, but I would imagine there would be a difference, yeah. Thanks.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
because like, I think like the migrants, when do they start? Because I would.
Yeah, I don't